Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be interviewing Andy Moore. He's the executive director of the National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, which we'll explain to you in detail what that's all about. They're an organization, a collective of many organizations, pro-democracy organizations, working to reform our democracy so it functions better for all Americans and is more inclusive for all Americans. Andy has a long and deep background in the field. He's currently an entrepreneur in residence, as well as being executive director of NANR, of Tom Love Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Oklahoma. Back in, I believe, in 2019-ish, Andy helped start People, Not Politicians. It's a grassroots gerrymandering movement in Oklahoma, I believe, which we'll get into that as one of the issues impacting on our democracy. He's been a staunch advocacy for democracy reform for many years, and also happens to be a licensed professional counselor for more than 10 years, teaching people how to listen and build relationships more. Certainly something related to some of the problems in our country in terms of the polarization that exists, in addition to the democracy reforms needed. So, Andy, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure having you.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here.
I guess the first question would be to explain what NANR, I'll use that term instead of National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, what NANR is all about, how you became executive director, and just explain a little more about it for our City Biz audience.
Sure, yeah. The National Association of Nonpartisan Reformers, we call it NANR, which I think lightens the mood a little bit in what is usually a heavy topic of politics and government. We function as a trade association for the many, many groups across the country who are working on issues related to the structure of how our democracy functions. We call that the structural democracy reform movement. It's issues like open versus closed primaries, alternative voting methods like ranked choice voting or approval voting. It's issues about gerrymandering, how districts for political officials get drawn, money in politics, or rather getting the money out of politics, really making sure that we are looking at who votes and how we vote. We've got about 70 organizations that are active participants right now, and what we recognize is that while we might not all agree on each individual issue, what unites us is that we are all pro-voter. We are looking at democracy from a voter standpoint of how do we improve it, how do we make it more responsive and more reflective of the people of America.
Well, if I understand it correctly from your explanation, it sounds like the NANR team, and the essence of NANR is the belief that there is really no one solution. So you don't try to rank which one's more important than the other. You feel that a rising tide lifts all boats. Would that be somewhat of an accurate explanation?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, David. Our members work in states and in cities, and we really get our motivation, our understanding of what democracy should look like from the people who live in each jurisdiction. So solutions that work in Michigan might be different than those that work in Oklahoma or Nevada. What we really want to do, I think all of our members are really trying to connect voters at the grassroots level, like voters in communities, and help them reimagine what democracy looks like, and maybe approach democracy for the next century with designs, with structures that reflect where America's at today, and not just rely on the ideas that might have worked 50, 100, or 200 years ago.
Well, let's help our audience reimagine a bit. If some of the things your members are working on, how would that, and maybe you can get into some specifics, how would that improve our democratic process? Would it lessen polarization? Would it increase or lessen the dysfunction in Congress? How help us imagine what changes would occur if many of the reforms or some of the reforms became national in scope?
Sure. So, there's a lot of energy across the United States right now around the issue of primary elections. In a presidential election year, this makes a lot of sense. Most of us have voted in primaries. And in a lot of states, voters are starting to recognize that their ability to cast their ballot for the candidate they like the most is in some cases limited by closed primaries, by the voters' either party affiliation if they already have one, or depending on how the elections are structured in that state. And so there's a growing movement for open primaries around the country to allow all voters to vote for the candidate that they like the best from the get-go, and not having to use, essentially a private popularity contest that is funded by public tax dollars as gatekeepers for what that election process looks like. And right there from the get-go, we see that there's an opportunity to open up elections to more voters, in particular voters who might not identify with either of the two major parties. Voters like I myself am a registered independent in my home state of Oklahoma, and that means that I, like about 400,000 other Oklahomans, can't vote in a lot of the primary elections that might decide statewide elected officials, or in some cases, Congress or the president. And so that alone could make a big difference. We see examples in states like Alaska, like Maine, where they've understand that there's a combination of reforms that might be more effective. Alaska a few years ago passed what's called a top four model, which is an open primary election system coupled with a ranked choice general election. So from looking at it from a voter standpoint, from the very first election in the cycle, everybody gets to vote for the candidate of their choice. And then in the general, to kind of winnow down the field, and then the general, you rank the candidates on your preference of first to fourth. And that really means that voters' full preferences are better expressed. And the important part here, David, is that changing the structure of our elections changes the incentives that politicians face, both in how they campaign for office and how they govern. Our system right now, with closed primaries and a first past the post, winner take all system, means that elected officials are really only responsive to the minority of voters from their party who turn out in those primary elections. But by changing those incentives, by opening up elections to the full field of voters, it means that candidates must be more responsive to voters from across the political spectrum. And that changes the rhetoric as they campaign, and how they govern, that they have to appeal to most voters, not just that hyper-partisan small subset of their party.
So I'm correct that many of the reforms you're working on, because you mentioned Alaska and Maine in particular, where I believe they're, am I correct that ranked choice voting is now the law in both those two states? Actually, let me sidetrack. Is that correct in Alaska and Maine?
Yeah, so Maine was one of the first states to pass ranked choice voting for statewide, and they've used it. I think this year they'll be using it in the presidential election as well. And then Alaska in 2020 passed, in 2018 passed Final Four, and yeah, Alaska passed it in 2020 and then used it in 2022 for statewide elected races. This will be the first year that they're using it in a presidential election cycle.
Right. And certain it's not only states, it could be cities and municipalities as well can adopt something like ranked choice voting. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a lot of cities. Utah is a great example. There's more than 20 cities in Utah that have voted at the municipal level to adopt and start using ranked choice voting. We've seen it in a few other cities. Fargo, North Dakota, voters there went with approval voting, which is another alternative voting system. There's a lot of interest, I think, especially when it gets down to a lot of municipal elections or school board or county level officials. Many of those races are already nonpartisan. And so the change to a system like ranked choice voting makes a lot of sense and is usually pretty easy to do. Sometimes people allege that systems like ranked choice are confusing to voters, and the data shows us that's really not the case. Whether it's in New York City, the Democrats in New York City have used it for their elections. It looks like it'll be on the ballot in Washington, D.C. And again, even cities like Fargo, North Dakota, or small towns in Utah use it with great success, and voters report that they really like using it. It's just as simple as ranking your favorite flavors of ice cream. We can all do that. For me, it's vanilla, cookies and cream, and then maybe chocolate down the list. When it comes to political candidates, it's the same idea.
Now you mentioned, well, I mentioned in your intro that you have personal experience in gerrymandering, and that's certainly one of the important democracy reform issues. What are NAR organizations, and which organizations are most involved in gerrymandering reform, and how is that reform being effectuated?
Yeah, so we're at an interesting point right now in 2024. We're right in the middle of the redistricting cycle. The census happens every 10 years, in years that end in zero, and then the following year, years that end in one, is when all of the political districts across the country get redrawn, from congressional races on down to city council wards and school board districts as well. And so a lot of attention gets paid to Congress and to state legislative races or state legislative districts. And so right now in 2024, we are seeing, the remainder of lawsuits kind of play out. And there's been a couple of states that have had their district lines redrawn by courts just in the last few months. Among our membership, we see a lot of organizations that spring up at the state level. Several years ago in 2018, there's a great effort in Michigan from an organization called Voters Not Politicians that really did just a bang-up job there. They had thousands of supporters across the state that worked together to pass an initiative petition at their state government to make that redistricting commission, a law. And that commission's done great work since then. Right now, there's a really big effort going on in Ohio. There's one in Oregon called People Not Politicians. Ohio, I believe it's called Citizens Not Politicians. You get a theme here that organizations are people on the ground wanting to take the job of drawing political districts away from the politicians themselves. There's no reason that politicians should get to draw their own districts. Just at face value, that seems unfair. And give it to a commission of citizens or regular folks who are able to do that. And so I think right now a lot of groups that are starting the conversation in their home states are talking about how do we get people to respond to the census in 2030. And as we do that, we should talk about what districts should look like for our state as we move into the next redistricting cycle in 2031.
And how does NANR play into this? What do you do for the 70 some odd organizations that are members? Do you offer them guidance, information? What is the purpose and how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. We serve to do three real big things. We convene, we connect, and we catalyze. We convene our members together in in-person formal summits, as well as more frequent, maybe virtual connections, things like Zoom meetings and kind of online digital summits to help bring together thought leaders, academics, programmatic leaders to share insights, to learn lessons from one another. We get to hear from experts about what's working in specific cities or states, and so that it can help us in other states kind of learn lessons from one another. It's really helpful, especially around shared issues. Like you just asked about gerrymandering. And when I was running a ballot initiative here in Oklahoma, it was my first time to get connected to folks in Virginia, Michigan, North Dakota, other states that were working on the same issue. It was really helpful to compare notes in a safe environment where you know that these people that you're talking to often share your values, especially around these specific policy issues. Beyond that, we also want to connect just our members to one another for kind of a shared knowledge base. So we share resources, whether it's a tech tools guide that provides a trusted source of information about all of the tech tools that are out there now to help everything from phone banking and text banking to canvassing to CRM and email clients you might be using to reach your supporters. It can be really helpful to have someone that's taken the time to do the demos, to read the reviews, to use hands-on experience to inform some sort of guide. If you're a startup organization working in democracy, there's a lot of information that gets thrown at you right away. And my organization tries to be a trusted source for that information coming down to help organizations grow, mature, and become better connected, and ultimately more effective at winning these kinds of reforms in their home state or home city.
And if someone, a business person or any individual is listening to this recording and is inspired by what you've talked about, how would they get involved? They really know nothing. They've never done anything in politics or democracy reform. What suggestions would you have? Can they contact NANR? How might a novice get involved?
One of the things that we've seen the last couple of years is a real interest coming from the business community. At our in-person summit that we had in February of this year, we had several representatives from the Young Presidents Organization, from YPO, who came, and they spoke to our audience about how important it is to defend and support a strong and representative democracy, because our economy depends on it, right? America's capitalist economy is built on the premise of a democratic institution underneath it, a strong democracy that is representative of its people. And these are business leaders, folks like Seth Radwell and Ron Miller, who recognize that their success as businessmen and women is ultimately a result of the strength of our democracy, not just the economy itself, but the government that allows that economy to flourish. And so we welcome business leaders, teachers, nonprofit professionals, anybody. You don't have to be, a policy wonk to care about democracy. All of our lives are touched by our governments, by policy decisions that are made up and down the ballot. And so if you have a specific area of interest or a specific policy issue you're interested in, and you're not sure where to get connected, we certainly welcome folks to reach out. I get emails every day from people who are wanting to connect with organizations in their home state or even national organizations to say, I've got some time, I'd like to volunteer, or I don't have any time, but I've got some resources I'd like to contribute, whether it's an in-kind, software package, or it's just financial support, particularly this year where we've got a presidential election and a lot of states are going to be voting on some sort of democratic reform. It's really a key time. This is an all hands on deck year, more so than I think we've seen in a generation. And we're really excited for the amount of interest and the amount of passion and energy that is around the democracy movement.
Well, you mentioned Seth Rodwell. I believe it's Seth David Rodwell, who wrote a great book. So I got to give a plug to him. I know David. Seth, American Schism, I believe is the name of his book. It's a great read on a historical analysis of some of what is part of our history, what we can learn from that in terms of what's happening today in our political world. Yes. I have a question related to a couple of things, because you mentioned the upcoming election. And the work we do is long term. When I say we, I'm a co-founder of the Bridge Alliance. And I've always thought that we're not going to create the healthy self-governance, and these democratic reforms aren't going to happen overnight. However, many people ask me, has my approach changed at all with what is seemingly a critical election, not necessarily who wins or loses, or perhaps it does depend on that, but the question of election integrity, election security, trusting in our elections, which is critical to our process. Are you folks working at all short term, or are you keeping your eye on the ball and realizing that your niche is democracy reform, and you can't get distracted by just another election?
Sure. Well, every election is consequential, right? Everything matters. While our game is a long-term game, a lot of these reforms are working on, national or nationwide adoption of some of these policy issues. I think we recognize that we are at a crossroads in America this year, where democracy is on the ballot in ways that it hasn't been before. And so whether it is fighting to protect the initiative petition in the 26 states where it's possible, or trying to add it or expand it in some new states, that's certainly a big focus. And then a lot of our work has included looping in more content and more thoughtfulness around elections workers, including protecting elections workers who have been openly threatened in a number of states, and ensuring that voters have confidence in the system that we have. Our efforts to reform elections is not because our election system is flawed in like the ways that we see in the news, right? Like voter fraud is not happening. Voting by mail is incredibly effective and secure. The National Vote at Home Institute has been one of our long-standing members, and they do amazing work in ensuring that elections officials in states and that voters themselves understand that voting by mail is safe and secure and reliable. And we want to amplify and repeat the messages of the organizations that are really working the front lines of protecting elections workers and ensuring that voters have confidence in our system. Our reforms long term are really designed to enhance and to bolster voters' confidence in our elections and in our democracy, and to ensure that their voice is more fully heard than maybe it is today, but that is in no way diminish the efficacy or the security of our system as it stands today.
I have a personal question. I mentioned earlier in introducing you that you also have 10 years of experience as a counselor. Do you have any insights into the connection between the democracy reform that we just spoke of and the cultural or divide, and whether it's cultural, whatever the divide is that's separating us as a nation? There are many organizations as part of the Bridge Alliance working more on that cultural end of it. Do you see a connection between the two, or are they totally separate parts of a movement to help and improve our democracy?
Yeah, some of this, my insight into this question, David, comes from my own experience of hosting, town hall meetings or even like backyard get-togethers with friends and people in my home state to talk about the issue of democracy, which is just not something that most folks sit around talking about in their backyard around a barbecue. But when it comes up, the conversation every time hits on both, right? There is a recognition, I think a broad recognition, that we as Americans are divided mostly along party lines in ways that we haven't been. And we could trace back the history of some of that to try to track up, like, how did we get here? But at the end of the day, this is where we're at now, and we need to look forward too to understand how do we build those bridges back together. And so there is a relational component to that, of being intentional about not operating in silos of information and opening up ourselves to talk to people, or at least listen to those who might see the world a little bit differently than we do. There's a lot to be learned from a variety of experiences and from having a more open approach to understanding the world around us, including our politics and our policy. When we look at how we bring about change, it is certainly ensuring that we are open and helping those around us to be more open to the idea that maybe things could be different, and then exploring what those differences could look like. And when it comes to structural reform, I think we have really concrete ways to make change. And as I said earlier, to change the incentives that politicians face. Most of us don't talk about the underlying structure of democracy. We talk about policy outcomes that are at the other end. If we want better policy, we have to incentivize better candidates to run. We have to incentivize candidates to run more effective, more responsive campaigns, and to govern as such. And so that really starts with changing the way that our elections are structured to ensure that we are incentivizing candidates and politicians to respond to the needs and the will of the people.
Well, perhaps a good way to end, if all the powerful work you're doing and what seems to me, and I hope our listeners, as logical reforms reach fruition in the next 5 or 10 years, how would that impact Americans? How would a life of a typical American change? Why is it important? I mean, it all sounds nice, but is it going to really change the day-to-day life of Americans who don't think about this type of stuff every day?
Yeah, it will. And I think this is one of the things that keeps me up at night and honestly gives me hope in the morning when I wake up as well, is that most people aren't thinking about politics. Most people don't like talking about politics, especially right now. But people are concerned about, the public schools that their kids go to. They're concerned about the quality of the roads they drive on, the cost of gas and milk, like just the real world things that we encounter every day. And all of that stuff is directly impacted by policy at some level, right? Federal, state, or local level. Elected officials are making decisions that impact our lives in ways we don't ever really consider. Until now, like we see headlines every day that are fueled by partisan bickering, by gridlock in Washington or maybe in the state house, and by reforming or changing the way that our elections are structured to change those incentives. We can change the inputs that will, and then in turn change the outputs of good public policy. So if there's an issue that you are frustrated by or concerned about or interested in, again, whether it's from public health to potholes, understanding how those decisions get made and who those people are, you can go back and start looking at how that person got into office and maybe what the incentives are for them to run. And I'll share a real quick personal connection to this is that, you mentioned earlier, like my background was in mental health, and I'm a licensed counselor, and I was working in public health. I was running a large clinic for people living with HIV and AIDS here in Oklahoma City. And in 2016, we reached a point where our patients were increasingly unable to access the medications they need to stay alive because our state legislature had made some decisions around the state budget that were very politically popular, right? Like they cut taxes because they knew that would help them get reelected. But the way that they did it was like a little too hasty, and it ended up coming back to bite them a few years later. And it really put our state in a real or a financial bind. And so my point of entry to this was just seeing my patients complain about the delays and their inability to get medications they needed to stay alive. And I thought, well, this is really frustrating. Like, how did this happen? And you start just kind of following that thread and doing a bit of a root cause analysis to understand that they can't get their meds because of these financial decisions that resulted in cuts to, the State Department of Health. Well, why did they make that decision? How did that get here? And going back and saying, oh, well, some of these folks were worried about getting reelected. And so I didn't fully appreciate that the election of a state legislator in a, middle of the country state could have an impact on someone's ability to overcome, what would be a terminal illness. And so that really led me to say, there's something else I could do to be involved. I need to help folks stay alive. Like that's a kind of a compelling ethos for me in my life, and help people live long and healthy lives. And I did not expect that would lead to examining the health of our democracy as a whole. And so I'm really excited. I love working at NANR and working with partners like the Bridge Alliance and others to help move Americans towards this same sort of realization, right? That the life we live, the world we live in, is shaped by public policy, and that policy is shaped by the elections and the structures for how those elections occur. And that's where our members get involved. That's the change we can make in the world. It's by making our government more responsive, more reflective of the American population, and more responsive to the majority of voters and what they want for the future.
Well, that's a perfect ending to a fascinating interview. Hopefully, our audience will realize the humanity that's involved in all these democracy discussions and how this does impact on our lives, on our children, our grandchildren, our health, and what's important to us as human beings. So thank you so much, Andy. I admire the work you do. And perhaps in 2 years, we'll have another interview, and we'll show Americans the incredible progress that you've made. Thank you again.